She walked into that town with $32, a leather satchel, and every intention of starting over. By sundown, the schoolhouse door was bolted against her. By nightfall, the boarding house had turned her away. And by the time the last lamp in Iron Hollow flickered out, Adeline Mercer was sitting alone on a feed crate in the dark, listening to the sound of an entire town deciding she was worth nothing. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the woman they'd just broken was the most dangerous kind of person alive, one who had absolutely nothing left to lose. If this story already has you gripped, drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this tale travels. Hit like, stay until the very end, and let's begin. The stagecoach dropped her at the edge of town like it was apologizing for the inconvenience. No proper station, just a wide patch of flattened dirt where the road widened briefly before narrowing again into the kind of street that every frontier town seemed to build the same way. One general store, one saloon, one church with a crooked cross on its steeple, and a scattering of wooden buildings that looked like they'd been nailed together by men in a hurry who never planned on staying long. Iron Hollow wasn't much to look at, but Adeline Mercer hadn't come here for the scenery. She stepped down from the coach, boots landing in the dry dust, and took a breath. The air smelled like wood smoke and animal sweat and something metallic underneath it all, a sharp mineral smell she couldn't quite place. She adjusted the satchel strap on her shoulder, picked up her travel trunk by one handle, and started dragging it toward the building that had a hand-painted sign above the door reading Iron Hollow Town Hall and Council Chambers, established 1869. The letter in her coat pocket had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases had gone soft. She didn't need to read it again. She had every word memorized. Dear Miss Mercer, we are pleased to extend an offer of employment as primary school teacher for the children of Iron Hollow, Kansas, commencing the first Monday of October. Accommodations will be arranged upon arrival. Please present yourself to the town council at your earliest convenience. Signed, Harold Briggs, council chairman. Earliest convenience. She was 3 days early, in fact, having caught a faster connection out of Dodge City than she'd expected. She told herself that was a good sign, getting ahead of things, starting fresh. She knocked on the town hall door with her knuckles, 3 firm raps, the way her mother had always told her a person of confidence knocked. The door opened. The man who filled the frame was wide across the shoulders and narrow in the eyes, somewhere north of 60, with a gray mustache that he'd clearly been cultivating for decades as a form of personal identity. He looked at Adeline the way a man looks at a package delivered to the wrong address. "Help you?" he said. "I'm Adeline Mercer," she said. "The new school teacher. I believe you're expecting me. I have a letter from Chairman Briggs." The man, who was not, as it turned out, Chairman Briggs, stared at her for a moment that lasted approximately 1 year. Then he said slowly, and stepped back from the door. She took that as an invitation and walked in. The room inside smelled like pipe tobacco and old paper. There were 4 men seated around a long wooden table, and they all looked up at her with expressions that ranged from surprise to uncomfortable to, in the case of the man at the far end, something she could only describe as carefully blank. That one, she'd learn, was Harold Briggs himself. 65 years old, iron gray hair parted precisely on the left, the kind of man who ironed his shirt collars and considered it a moral virtue. "Miss Mercer," he said, without standing, "we weren't expecting you until Monday. I caught an earlier connection." She set her satchel on the floor beside her and stood straight. "I hope that's not an inconvenience." "Sit down," said the man with the mustache, who had taken his seat again at Briggs's left hand. He did not say it unkindly. He said it the way men of that era said most things to women, reflexively, without really thinking about whether the woman in question might have preferred a please. She sat. Briggs clasped his hands on the table and studied her for a moment. "Miss Mercer, before we discuss the particulars of your position, there's a matter we need to address." "All right," she said. "We received a letter," he said, "from Cartwright County, from a man named Vernon Colt. He was on the school board there when you were employed as a teacher in Millhaven 2 years ago." Adeline felt the floor shift slightly beneath her. Not literally, but that particular kind of internal drop that the body performs when it knows, before the mind is quite ready to admit it, that something bad is coming. "I see," she said. He writes that you were dismissed from your position in Millhaven under troubling circumstances. Briggs unfolded a piece of paper from the table in front of him. He read from it without looking up. He states that you engaged in, quote, inappropriate personal conduct with a married man in the community, causing significant damage to the moral order of the school and distressing his wife considerably. He folded the paper again. Is that an accurate account? The room was so quiet she could hear a horse shifting its weight outside in the street. No, Adeline said. It is not. No, to which part? To all of it. She kept her voice even, though it cost her. Vernon Cole's brother was on the Millhaven School Board, and when I reported that funds designated for school materials were being redirected into private pockets, I was dismissed within the week. The story about personal conduct was invented afterward. I have written statements from 3 families in Millhaven who will confirm this, if you'd like to send for them. Briggs looked at the men beside him. The man with the mustache, whose name she'd find out later, was Percival Yates, and who owned the largest spread of land within 30 miles, gave a small shrug that communicated volumes. The other 2 men, younger, looked at their hands. Miss Mercer, Briggs said carefully, I have no doubt you believe your account is accurate. It is accurate. The difficulty, he continued, as if she hadn't spoken, is that Mr. Cole is a known man with a settled reputation. You are a stranger to us, and the parents of this town, the parents of the children you would be teaching, take the moral character of their school teacher very seriously. As they should, she said, which is why I'd encourage you to investigate the matter thoroughly before making any decision. We've already made a decision, Yates said. He said it without cruelty, which was almost worse, just a statement of fact, the way you'd announce the weather. We voted this morning. She looked at him, then at Briggs. You voted before I arrived? Before you'd spoken to me at all? The letter arrived 4 days ago, Briggs said. We felt it was our responsibility to act. To act, she repeated, by deciding my guilt before hearing my side. We decided that the community's peace comes first. Briggs stood, which apparently meant the conversation was over. We're sorry you've come all this way, Miss Mercer. We'll cover the cost of your stage fare back to... Where did you come from? Wichita, she said. She stood too, slowly. And I don't want your stage fare. Be that as it may, what I want, she said, and something in her voice changed. Not louder, not harder, but more settled, the way metal sounds different when it's fully cooled, is the opportunity to do the job I was hired to do. I came here to teach your children. I have 6 years of teaching experience, and I am very good at it. If you won't give me that chance, at least have the honesty to call it what it is. What would you call it? Yates said, with a slight raising of one eyebrow that might have been curiosity and might have been amusement. Cowardice, she said, dressed up as caution. The room got very quiet again. Briggs's jaw tightened. You may collect your things. We'll arrange for you to stay at the boarding house tonight at our expense, and the stage runs again Thursday. That's 4 days. Yes. I'll manage, she said, and picked up her satchel. She managed for approximately 6 hours. The boarding house was run by a woman named Ruth Calhoun, who was not an unkind person in ordinary circumstances. But ordinary circumstances had been disrupted by the fact that in the time it took Adeline to walk from the town hall to the boarding house, a distance of perhaps 300 yards, some version of the story had already arrived ahead of her. Small towns had their own kind of telegraph, faster and less accurate than the real one. Ruth Calhoun met her at the door with the expression of a woman caught between sympathy and self-preservation had clearly won. I'm sorry, she said. She actually looked it, which Adeline supposed was something. My husband says he doesn't want the trouble. There are families who board here regular. He says, it's all right, Adeline said, though it wasn't. Can you recommend somewhere else? Ruth Calhoun looked at her feet. There's the saloon, but... No, thank you, Mrs. Calhoun. She walked back out into the street. The sun was getting lower, painting the dust orange. A few people moved along the boardwalk on either side. A woman with a basket, 2 men in work clothes, a boy rolling a hoop. They looked at her the way people look at something unfamiliar and slightly suspect, not staring exactly, but tracking her passage with their peripheral vision. She stood in the middle of the street for a moment and considered her options, which were exactly as limited as they appeared. She had $32.14. She had a trunk full of teaching materials, 3 dresses, a worn copy of Middlemarch she'd read so many times the spine had given up, and letters of reference from Millhaven that apparently meant nothing here. She had no family within 500 miles. She had no friends in Iron Hollow. She had a return ticket she hadn't bought yet and wasn't sure she wanted to buy. And she realized, as she stood there in the fading light with her satchel cutting into her shoulder, a very firm and possibly unreasonable determination not to leave. She wasn't entirely sure where it came from. Pride, maybe. Stubbornness, her mother would have said, not as a compliment. But there was something else underneath it, too, something she couldn't have articulated clearly in that moment. The bone-deep knowledge that if she left now, it would confirm every word Vernon Cole had put in that letter. And she had spent 2 years already carrying that weight, and she was tired of it. She was not leaving. She dragged her trunk to the side of the street, sat down on it, and started thinking. Isham. The forge announced itself before she saw it. A deep, rhythmic clanging that she could feel in her chest as much as here, coming from the far end of the main street where the buildings thinned out, and a low stone building squatted at the road's edge, with a chimney pouring pale smoke into the autumn air. A sign hung above the wide-open double doors. Boone Ironworks. Horseshoe, hardware, custom work. She wasn't entirely sure what drew her there. Later, she'd tell herself she was simply walking to the end of the street to think, and the forge happened to be where the street ended. But the truth was probably simpler than that. In a town that had closed its doors to her, at least this door was literally open. She stopped in the wide doorway and looked in. The man at the anvil had his back to her. He was big, not in the exaggerated, theatrical way of a man who has cultivated size as a kind of performance, but in the practical, unglamorous way of someone whose body had been shaped over years by hard physical work. His shirt sleeves were rolled past his elbows, and the firelight from the forge made the muscles of his forearms look cast in copper. He was working a piece of iron with a hammer, and each blow was precise and unhurried, the kind of efficiency that comes from doing the same thing so many thousand times that it's become part of how you breathe. He didn't hear her over the clanging, or if he did, he finished the blow he was on before he turned. When he turned, she saw he was younger than she'd expected, mid-30s probably, with a face that had been weathered but not yet carved by time, dark hair pushed back from his forehead and damp at the temples from the heat. He had the kind of face that didn't do much on the surface but clearly held more underneath, like a river that looked calm from the bank. He looked at her without particular surprise, which she found oddly reassuring. "You're in the doorway," he said. Not aggressively, just noting it. "I am," she said. "I'm Adeline Mercer. I was the new schoolteacher until about 3 hours ago." He studied her for a moment, hammer still in hand, and she had the sense he was deciding something. "I heard," he said. "Elias Boone." He didn't offer his hand, and his were both occupied, and there was a logic to that she appreciated. "What can I do for you?" "I'm not entirely sure," she admitted. "I think I'm looking for a place to stay, and I've run out of conventional options." He set the hammer down on the anvil with a soft clank and straightened up fully. He was considerably taller than she was, which she noted mostly because it meant she had to tilt her chin up slightly to look at him directly, and she preferred looking at people directly. "They turned you out of Ruth Calhoun's place," he said. It wasn't a question. "They did. You know what they're saying about you." "I know what's being said, yes. It isn't accurate." He looked at her for a long moment. He didn't say "I believe you," and he didn't say "I'm not sure I do," which she found she respected. He was just looking at her, the way a man measures the soundness of a piece of iron before he decides how to work it. "I've got a room above the shop," he said finally. "Nothing fancy, storeroom mostly. There's a cot and a window. I could clear the boxes." She blinked. "Why?" "Why what? Why would you do that? You don't know me. Your neighbors are going to have opinions." The corner of his mouth moved in something that was almost, but not quite, a smile. "My neighbors already have opinions about everything I do. I've stopped finding it interesting." He picked up a rag from the workbench and wiped his hands. "You can have the room for room and board, meaning you'd cook for the 3 of us, me and my 2 kids. You have children, son named Thomas, 12 years old, daughter named Clara, 8. Their mother passed 3 years back." He said it flatly, not without feeling, but without performance. Just the plain shape of a fact he'd learned to carry. Thomas struggles with his letters something bad. Claire is clever, but she gets bored and turns mean when she's bored. They haven't had regular schooling since we moved out here. Adeline looked at him. She looked around the forge, at the fire and the iron and the rough stone walls and the smell of hot metal that was already getting into her hair and clothes. She looked at the narrow stairway in the corner that presumably led to the room he was describing, which almost certainly had a dirt floor and smelled like the shop and was nothing like the modest but clean boarding house room she'd been hoping for. "I'll take it," she said. The room was exactly as bad as she'd expected, and she didn't care even a little. It was maybe 12 feet square, with a low ceiling that Elias had to duck through the door to clear, and a single window that looked out over the alley behind the forge. The cot was iron-framed and narrow. The boxes Elias moved were heavy and numerous. Spare parts, mostly, sorted with a rough logic she could see the outline of but not yet follow. There was a wooden crate she could use as a desk if she angled it right. The floor was wood, not dirt, which was better than she'd braced for. It smelled like coal smoke and machine oil and cold air. She sat on the edge of the cot, which creaked dramatically, and held the cot's frame and looked around the room. For about 30 seconds, she let herself feel the full weight of the day. The council chamber, Briggs's flat voice reading Cole's lies aloud, the careful defeat in Ruth Calhoun's eyes, the orange dust of the street, the $32, the 500 miles of prairie between her and anyone who knew her name. 30 seconds. She counted. Then she got up and started unpacking her trunk. She met the children at supper. The kitchen was attached to the living quarters behind the forge, a separate building connected by a covered walkway, and it was the kind of kitchen that communicated volumes about the life lived inside it. Functional. Clean enough, but without the softness that a woman's longer-term presence might have added. The pots were good quality, well used. The table was big and solid. There were 2 chairs and a bench, and Adeline sat on the bench because the children had the chairs, and she hadn't yet earned the right to rearrange things. Thomas Boone came in first. He was tall for 12, with his father's dark hair and a defensive set to his shoulders that Adeline recognized immediately. The posture of a child who has been told, in too many ways and too many times, that he is less capable than other people. He looked at her from the doorway with an expression of comprehensive suspicion. "You're the teacher they didn't want," he said. Beside her, she heard Elias make a sound from the fireplace that might have been a cough or might have been a suppressed response. "That's accurate," Adeline said. "You must be Thomas." "Yeah." He sat down in his chair and pulled it slightly away from the table with his feet, a small physical act of establishing distance. "Are you going to try to teach me to read?" "I don't know yet," she said. "I just arrived." He seemed marginally disarmed by that. It wasn't the answer he'd been bracing for. Clara came in at a run and stopped dead in the middle of the kitchen when she saw Adeline, which suggested she hadn't been warned, or hadn't believed the warning, or both. She was small for 8, with lighter coloring than her brother. She must have favored her mother. And a pair of dark eyes that went around the room taking inventory the way a banker counts coins. "Who are you?" she demanded. "Adeline Mercer. I'm going to be staying in the room above your father's forge for a while." "Why?" "Because I needed a place to stay, and your father was kind enough to offer." Clara looked at her father, then back at Adeline, then at her father again. "Is she going to teach us?" "If she's willing," Elias said without turning from the fireplace. "I'm willing," Adeline said. "Thomas hates reading," Clara announced, with the cheerful brutality of younger siblings everywhere. "Clara," Elias said. "He does, though." "I know he does," Elias said. He set a pot on the table, something with beans and salt pork that smelled better than it looked. "Everybody knows. It doesn't need announcing." Thomas stared at his bowl. Adeline watched him stare at his bowl and felt a small, specific recognition, not of the exact circumstance, but of the particular quality of a person waiting for the world to confirm their worst suspicion of themselves. She'd seen it before, in classrooms, always in the children who got labeled slow or difficult or hopeless, always in the children who needed the most and received the least. "I don't like arithmetic," she offered into the silence. Thomas looked up. "Never did," she continued. "Numbers make a kind of sense to other people that they don't make to me, no matter how many times I work through it. I had a teacher once who spent the better part of a year trying to convince me I was lazy rather than just bad at numbers. I was not lazy. She picked up her spoon. Just bad at numbers. Thomas looked at her for a moment with the careful, measuring look of someone deciding whether this was a trick. So what did you do? He said, finally. Found someone who could explain it differently, she said. Third time's the charm. The third teacher I had for it actually made some headway. Turned out I needed to see it drawn out, not just written down. Said Thomas, and returned to his bowl. But his shoulders had dropped about half an inch. Clara was watching Adeline with bright, calculating eyes. Can you teach me about the planets? She said. Yes. Papa says there are 9. There are 8 that most astronomers agree on, Adeline said. There's debate about the 9th. Clara's eyes went wider. There's debate? Elias, at the end of the table, looked up from his food for just a moment. Adeline caught the look. Brief, evaluating, not unfriendly, and then he looked back down. The first week was mostly about survival. Adeline established herself in the forge room, which she began privately calling the loft, because it made it feel more intentional. She organized her teaching materials along one wall, the books, the slates, the worn primers she'd been hauling around for 6 years. She found a rhythm with the kitchen, learning which shelves held what, negotiating the difference between Elias's method, practical, sequential, focused on what was immediately necessary, and her own, slightly more hopeful, inclined toward cooking things that required more effort but tasted significantly better. She didn't attempt formal lessons the first week. That was deliberate. Thomas was distrustful of her in a way that went beyond ordinary wariness. Every other day or so, someone in town, another child probably, feeding something they'd overheard their parents saying, would get something through to him about what kind of woman she was supposed to be. He'd come in with his shoulders higher and his eyes harder, and she'd know the rumors had reached him again without his father's filter. She didn't confront it directly. She just kept being present. She cooked supper. She read in the evenings in the kitchen, where the light was better, and didn't comment when Thomas drifted in and sat in the corner pretending to do something else but clearly watching what she was reading. She helped Clara find a book about the planets in her collection, which Clara received with the reverence of a person handed something precious, and then read with such ferocious speed that she came back 2 days later with a dozen questions that Adeline answered one by one, and then a dozen more. Elias she saw mostly at the edges of days, early morning and evening. He was not an unfriendly man, but he was a private one. He said what needed saying and left silence for the rest, which she found restful rather than uncomfortable. He'd made her a small shelf for the loft without being asked, nailed it to the wall beside the window so she could keep her books off the cot, and said nothing about it when she thanked him, just nodded once and went back downstairs. On the 8th day, she found the ledger. She'd offered to help him with the shop's paperwork, not because she was angling for anything, but because she'd seen the stack of papers on the corner of his workbench getting taller, and she had time in the afternoons, and she was the kind of person who found disorder genuinely difficult to be near. He'd handed over the ledger with a combination of relief and embarrassment that told her the situation was worse than it looked. It was worse than it looked. Elias Boone was skilled at his work. The orders were there, the customers were real, the prices were fair. But the bookkeeping was a disaster. Not from dishonesty, just from the complete absence of any system. Payments received were recorded in the margins of supply receipts. Supply costs weren't tracked against income. Several customers appeared to owe amounts that hadn't been invoiced. And there was a loan, a significant one, from Percival Yates, of all people, that Elias was paying interest on at a rate that didn't make sense given what she could reconstruct of his income. She sat with the ledger for 2 evenings before she said anything. She wanted to understand it fully before she put it in front of him. Elias, she said, on the 3rd evening. He was at the table cleaning a length of chain. Do you know what your actual profit margin is right now, per month? He didn't look up immediately. Roughly. Would you like to know precisely? He looked up then. Is it bad news? It's complicated news, she said. I'd rather show you than tell you. Do you have an hour? He had an hour. She spread the papers across the table and walked him through what she'd found. Methodically, without dramatizing it, because he didn't need drama, he needed information. He listened with his arms folded and his jaw tight, which she was learning was just how he processed things he found difficult. He wasn't angry, he was absorbing. When she got to the loan from Yates, she laid out the numbers carefully. "This rate," she said, pointing to the figure in the margin where he'd written the terms, "is not standard. This is the rate you charge someone when you expect them to fail." Elias was quiet for a moment. He said it was the going rate. "It is not the going rate," she said. Another silence. "How do you know about loan rates?" "My father had a hardware store," she said. "He had a loan he shouldn't have had for 15 years before he figured out the same thing. By then, half the business was already gone." She looked at him steadily. "You still have time to renegotiate, but you'd need leverage, and that means your books have to be clean and clear enough that you can show him you know exactly where you stand." Elias looked at the papers on the table for a long time. Then he said quietly, "My wife used to do the books." He said it without looking at her. "She was better at this kind of thing than I am." It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife as someone she had been, a real, specific person with specific capabilities, rather than as an absence. "Then I'll try to do it justice," Adeline said. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted slightly, not dramatically, just a small rearrangement, like the way light changes when a cloud moves off. He didn't say anything, but he unfolded his arms. The lessons began in the second week. Not in any formal sense. There was no moment of announcement, no desks arranged in rows. The forge wasn't built for that, and Adeline wasn't sure rigid formality was what these children needed anyway. It happened more gradually than that, the way water finds a path downhill, inevitable once it starts, but quiet about it. She started with Clara because Clara was easy to start with. The girl was insatiably curious, and curiosity was the best raw material a teacher could work with. They began in the mornings while Elias was in the forge and Thomas was doing the outdoor chores. 30 minutes with the planet book, which expanded into questions about the stars, which led to a lesson about how sailors navigated by them, which prompted Clara to ask, with great seriousness, whether she could be a sailor. "Women have been sailors," Adeline told her. Clara stared. "Real ones?" "Real ones. It wasn't common, and it wasn't easy, and they often had to pretend to be something they weren't to manage it. But, yes." "That's unfair," Clara said, with the direct, uncomplicated moral clarity of an 8-year-old who hasn't yet learned to complicate her indignation. "Yes," Adeline agreed. "It is unfair." "Is it still unfair now?" "Largely, though improving, in places." Clara considered this for a moment with the weight of a judge deliberating. "I might want to be a sailor or an astronomer," she said. "I haven't decided." "You have time," Adeline said. "In the meantime, let's work on your arithmetic so that either option stays available." Thomas was harder. She didn't push him the first week of lessons. She let him orbit the margins of what she was doing with Clara, doing his own work nearby. There was always something to be done in the forge, always an errand or a task, while she taught his sister. She made sure she could be heard without raising her voice. She left books in places where he might encounter them. On the 4th day, he sat down at the kitchen table while she was working through a reading primer with Clara and said, without preamble, "That one's too easy for her." Adeline looked up. "You think so?" "She read that whole page in 2 minutes. She does that with everything. She acts like she can't do things, but she can do everything already." Clara, with great dignity, said, "I was being polite." "You were stalling," Thomas said. "I was—" Clara stopped, made a face. "Fine." Adeline looked at Thomas. "What would you give her instead?" He was quiet for a moment, the question clearly unexpected. He stood up from the table, went to the shelf where Adeline had organized her books, looked along the spines with the careful nonchalance of someone pretending not to know exactly what they're looking for, and pulled out a volume. He brought it back and put it on the table in front of Clara. "This one," he said. "It's got a story in it. She likes stories." Adeline looked at the book. "How do you know what's in it?" "I looked at the pictures," he said, sitting back down. He kept his eyes on the table. "And I could tell what the words probably said from the pictures. Mostly." She looked at him for a moment. He was still not looking at her. "Can I show you something?" she said. He shrugged, which she was learning meant yes. She opened the primer to the first page, not the children's primer, her own copy, the one with larger text, and laid it flat on the table in front of him. Then she took a clean sheet of paper and drew a simple scene. A barn, a horse, a man walking toward it. "What's the man doing?" she asked. "Going to the barn," Thomas said immediately. "What does this word say?" She pointed to a word below the picture. He looked at it, looked at the picture. "Going?" he tried. "Close. Walked. But you were thinking in the right direction." She wrote the word on another piece of paper, then drew a simple illustration of legs moving. "What do you notice about this word versus this picture?" And something shifted. Not all at once, not dramatically, but she watched Thomas Boone look at a word and a picture together, and somewhere behind his eyes, which were dark like his father's and held the same quality of contained depth, something clicked into a slightly different position. "The word's shorter than I thought it would be," he said. "Words usually are," she said. "We make them bigger in our heads because we're afraid of them." He looked at her. "Did someone teach you that, about fearing words?" "Someone taught me the idea," she said. "The word's part. I figured out myself, watching students." He picked up the pencil she'd left beside the paper. He looked at the sentence on the page. He looked at her illustration. "Can you do another one?" he said. She didn't hear about the first round of new rumors until Elias told her, 2.5 weeks into her stay, with the particular discomfort of a man delivering news he knows will land badly, but has decided the other person deserves to hear. He told her in the evening, after the children were in bed. He was at the workbench doing an inventory, and she was at the kitchen table working on his books, and he came in from the forge with the look of someone who has been carrying something and has decided to set it down. "There's talk," he said. She put her pen down. "What kind of talk?" He pulled out the opposite chair and sat down, which was unusual. He normally stood in doorways for short conversations and sat only for long ones. The sitting down told her something. "People are saying you manipulated your way into this house," he said. He said it straight, which she appreciated. "That you couldn't get the teaching job, so you manufactured a dependency instead. Made yourself needed so you'd have somewhere to stay." He paused. "There's a version involving the children about you being inappropriate with them, but that one I shut down directly when I heard it, and I think it's lost most of its legs." Her hands were flat on the table, and she was very still. "Who's saying it?" "Yates, mostly. His wife. Some of the families who don't want their children taught by you." He looked at her. "None of it is true. I know that." "You know it," she said. "But the town is going to say what Yates wants the town to say until something changes that equation." He rested his forearms on the table. "I wanted you to hear it from me." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "There's a teaching position in Hartwell, the county seat. I received a letter this week. Word apparently travels in both directions, and someone there heard I was available. It's an established school, proper building, decent pay." She looked at him. "It would end your problem." "My problem," he repeated flatly. "The trouble my presence is causing, my problem," he said again, "is that my son spent the first 40 minutes of supper tonight teaching his sister something you'd taught him this morning, and he didn't stutter once. My problem is that I watched Clara read a full page of a book without stopping, and then look up at me like she'd discovered she had wings." He was quiet for a moment. "The town's opinion of you isn't a problem I'm particularly interested in solving by removing you from my house." She looked at him. He was looking at the table, which she was learning was where he looked when he was saying something that mattered to him, and he didn't want to watch it land. "Elias." He looked up. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, once, and then, because he was not a man who knew how to receive gratitude gracefully, and probably never would be, he stood up and said, "The interest payment on the Yates loan is due next week. Walk me through the renegotiation argument again in the morning." "Of course," she said. And that was that. Outside the forge window, Iron Hollow settled into the quiet of another frontier night. The wind off the plains, the distant sound of the saloon's poorly tuned piano, the creak of wood contracting in the cold. Inside, the lamp on the kitchen table burned steadily, and Adeline Mercer picked up her pen and went back to the numbers. The town had decided she was worth nothing. She had decided some weeks ago that the town's arithmetic was wrong. She intended to prove it. The week settled into a pattern, the way things do when people stop fighting the shape of their lives and start working inside it. Mornings belonged to the lessons, not formal ones. Adeline had given up on the idea of formal anywhere around the second week when she'd tried to set up a proper schedule with written times, and Clara had looked at it the way a cat looks at a closed door, with pure philosophical indifference. What worked instead was something looser and more honest. She taught when the children were ready to receive it, which was usually in the 2 hours before Elias's first customers arrived, and the forge got too loud to think, and again in the late afternoon when the shop work slowed. Thomas was making progress. She wouldn't call it fast progress because it wasn't, and she'd learned that calling slow progress fast was the surest way to destroy a child's trust in you the moment reality failed to match the description. But it was real. He was beginning to recognize word shapes the way he recognized the shapes of tools, not by sounding each letter out laboriously, which had never worked for him, but by pattern, by context, by the picture her illustrations made alongside the text. She'd started drawing less and less each week, deliberately, weaning him off the visual scaffolding 1 degree at a time, and he hadn't noticed yet that she was doing it. That was the point. Clara, for her part, had burned through everything in Adeline's collection that was appropriate for her age, and was now working through things that weren't, which Adeline had decided to stop apologizing for. The girl was going to be formidable. You could already see the shape of it. The loan renegotiation happened on a Thursday morning, in Percival Yates's office above his land management company, and Elias had walked in there with the clean, organized books Adeline had spent 3 evenings rebuilding and laid them on the desk and said, in his flat, measured way, that he'd like to discuss the terms. Yates had not been pleased. Yates had, in fact, deployed a 15-minute speech about good faith and market rates, and the risks a lender took in extending credit to a one-man forge operation in a frontier town that Elias had sat through without expression. Then Elias had pointed to 3 specific figures in the ledger and asked Yates to explain the discrepancy. Yates had reduced the rate, not to what it should have been. The man was not going to suddenly become generous, but enough that Elias walked back to the forge with an extra $12 a month he hadn't had before, which was the difference between barely managing and cautiously breathing. He told Adeline that evening while she was making supper, standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, the way he stood when he wasn't quite sure how to say something. "It worked," he said. She looked up from the pot. "I know, I could tell from the way you walked back." He looked at her. "How could you tell from the way I walked back?" "You were walking faster," she said. "You walk slow when you're carrying something heavy." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know that." "Most people don't know their own tells," she said. "It's not a criticism." Digging the teat, he came in and sat down at the table, properly sat, both hands flat, the way he sat when something was actually on his mind. She left him to it and kept stirring. "You saved my business," he said finally. "The books, the renegotiation. I want you to know I understand that." "You had a functioning business," she said. "It just couldn't see itself clearly." "That's a generous reading." "It's an accurate one." She set 2 bowls on the table. "Call the children, please." He did. And that was the closest they came, in those weeks, to talking about what was growing between them, which was the kind of thing neither of them was ready to name, and both of them could feel, like a change in the air pressure before weather comes. The town didn't soften, exactly, but it developed complications. The complications arrived in the form of Margaret Holt, whose husband ran the dry goods store, and whose children, 3 of them, ranging in age from 7 to 14, had been attending the official school under the care of a rotating series of teachers who never lasted more than 2 seasons before moving on to somewhere that paid better. Margaret Holt had seen Adeline twice in passing on the main street and had avoided her both times with the determined visual diplomacy of a woman who had opinions she hadn't yet decided to voice. She showed up at the forge on a Tuesday afternoon. Adeline was in the kitchen working on a geography lesson with Clara. They had a hand-drawn map spread across the table, Clara adding detail with a pencil while Adeline pointed to places and asked questions. When she heard the knock at the front, Elias was in the shop. She heard voices and a pause, and then Elias appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Woman here asking to speak with you," he said. His face was carefully neutral, which meant he didn't know what to make of it. Margaret Holt was not what Adeline had expected. She'd been expecting something harder, given the way the town's female population had generally positioned themselves. What she got was a woman in her late 30s who looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the time of day, the particular exhaustion of someone doing more than they should be doing for longer than they wanted. "Miss Mercer," she said. She had a basket over one arm, which she was gripping rather tightly. "I'm Margaret Holt. My husband and I have the dry goods on Main." "I know who you are," Adeline said. "Would you like to come in?" Margaret came in, looked at Clara, bent over her map, and something in her face shifted. "Is that a geography lesson?" "It is," Clara said, without looking up. "Do you know where the Caspian Sea is? It's a lake, but it's called a sea, which Miss Mercer says is because the people who named it didn't know any better." "Clara," Adeline said. "She said it," Clara maintained. "I said the naming was a product of limited geographical knowledge at the time, which is not the same as not knowing any better." "It's the same thing." Margaret Holt made a sound that was, unexpectedly, very close to a laugh. She pressed her lips together quickly after, as if surprised by it. "My oldest can't do his multiplication tables," she said to Adeline. "He's 14. The school has been working on it for 3 years, and I don't know if he's better or worse than when he started." She was quiet for a moment. The basket handle creaked under her grip. "I don't know what they're saying about you is true or not. I'm not going to pretend I haven't heard it, but I've also watched my son sit in that schoolhouse for 3 years and come home knowing less than I think he should, and I'm out of patience for waiting for it to improve." "What are you asking?" Adeline said. "I'm asking if you'd consider taking on my children," Margaret said. "Privately. I can pay a small amount. Not what you deserve, probably, but something." Adeline looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the kitchen, which was already barely adequate for 2 children, and at Clara's map taking up the full table, and at the corner of the room where Thomas's growing collection of illustrated vocabulary papers was pinned to the wall in a slightly crooked line. "Bring them Thursday morning," she said. "We'll see how it goes." Margaret nodded. She set the basket on the table. There were apples inside, Adeline saw. A very frontier form of formal offering. "Thank you," she said. After she left, Clara looked up from her map. "Are the Holt kids nice?" "I don't know," Adeline said. "Are you going to make them feel welcome regardless?" Clara made a face. "Probably." "That's sufficient," Adeline said. Nansam. The Holt children were Edmund, 14, and shut down around anything that smelled like school. Dora, 11, and quiet in the way that was often mistaken for slow, and wasn't. And Henry, 7, and absolutely feral in a purely energetic sense. Not a mean bone in his body, but enough kinetic force to power a small mill. Edmund was the one she was most concerned about, and not because of the multiplication tables. The multiplication tables were a symptom. What Edmund Holt had was something she'd seen before, a mind that worked differently than the tools available to teach it, and years of being measured against those tools and found wanting, until he'd quietly decided the problem was him. He sat at the table on the first Thursday with his arms crossed and the expression of someone waiting for something to go wrong. She didn't start with the multiplication tables. She asked him what he knew about horses. He looked at her. "What?" "Horses. You work in your father's store. You must take delivery of goods, handle accounts, manage inventory." "Some of that, yeah." "Then you already do multiplication," she said. "If a supply order comes in and each crate weighs 40 pounds, and you have 16 crates, how much weight is on the wagon?" He was quiet. 640 pounds, he said after a moment. "You did that in your head. That's different. Why?" "Because it's real. It matters." He looked genuinely puzzled by her, which was not an unfamiliar experience for her. "Numbers are only real when they're attached to something real," she said. "That's not a personal flaw. That's just how some minds work. We're going to do the tables the same way, attached to something." She slid a piece of paper toward him. "What do you price most often in the store?" He told her. "Flour, mostly. Salt. Sometimes timber lengths." By the end of the hour, he'd worked through his 3s and 4s without once treating them as abstract symbols, and without getting a single one wrong. Dora turned out to be the opposite problem. She'd been told for years she was slow, and she'd accepted it so completely that she second-guessed every answer she had before she gave it, even when the answer was right. Adeline worked on that more carefully than anything else, the way you work on something that's been bent out of shape, which is to say slowly and without forcing it. Henry she largely let run until he burned enough energy to sit down, which took about 20 minutes, after which he was actually quite engaged, because he was 7 and the world was endlessly interesting to him, and he just needed help directing the interest. Elias watched the expanding situation from a slight remove, with the expression of a man watching something grow in a space he'd thought was too small to hold it. He didn't object. He didn't comment much either. But Adeline would sometimes catch him in the doorway between the forge and the kitchen, just for a moment, watching the table full of children with a look she didn't try to interpret because it felt like something private. The evenings, though. The evenings were different. The children went to bed and the house settled, and sometimes they sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and talked. Not always about the books or the business or the lessons, sometimes about other things. About Kansas and what it was like to come here with intention and find the place had its own ideas. About the work of building something in soil that wasn't sure it wanted you. He talked about his wife once, more specifically than he had before. Her name was Hannah. She'd been from Ohio. She'd come west because she wanted to see what was out there, and she'd never regretted it, even when it was hard. He said that last part simply, without embellishment, and Adeline understood that it was also something he told himself. "Do you miss Ohio?" he asked her once, though she'd never said she was from Ohio. She'd mentioned it in passing weeks earlier, and he'd apparently held on to it. "I miss having a place that was unambiguously mine," she said. "Not any specific place, just the fact of it. A shelf that's your shelf without explaining why." He was quiet for a moment. "The shelf I put up in the loft," he said. "Yes," she said. "That shelf." He looked at the table, then, "You could put shelves wherever you needed them. In here too, if you wanted." He said it without drama, like it was a practical suggestion, which it was and also wasn't. She looked at him. He was not looking at her. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's just shelves," he said. "I know," she said, and they sat there for a while in the lamplight, not saying the thing that was clearly there to be said, and perhaps neither of them was ready for it, and perhaps that was all right. Some things needed the weight of time before they could hold their own shape. Tucked. The letter from Hartwell arrived on a Wednesday, re-forwarded from an address she'd had briefly in Wichita. It was on proper school board letterhead, the Hartwell County School District, and it offered her a position as lead teacher at their established schoolhouse at a salary she hadn't earned in her 6 years of teaching. It was everything that the situation in Iron Hollow was supposed to have been, without the complications. She read it twice, sitting on the edge of the cot in the loft with the autumn wind finding every gap in the wall. She thought about the Hartwell letter in a particular way, which was, honestly. She was honest with herself the way she was honest with her students, without the softening that made things easier to hear but murkier to act on. Hartwell was safe. Hartwell was what she'd been working toward for 2 years since Millhaven. A proper position, a proper wage, a proper roof, and none of the whispers and closed doors, and Percival Yates looking at her across a room with that particular brand of patient contempt. She thought about Thomas, who had, just that morning, read a full paragraph aloud from a book, a real book, not a primer, and then looked up at her with an expression she didn't have a word for, the particular expression of someone who has just realized something they'd been told was impossible was actually real. She folded the letter and put it in the pocket of her dress and went downstairs to help with supper. She didn't tell Elias that night, or the next morning. She needed to hold the decision herself for a few days before she could hand it to someone else, because once she said it out loud, it would start becoming a choice she'd actually made, and she wasn't quite sure yet which choice that was. But Elias, who paid attention to things in the way of people who've learned that not paying attention has consequences, noticed something was different. "You're quieter than usual," he said 3 days later. He was at the workbench. She'd come in from the kitchen ostensibly to ask about supper, but he'd seen through that in the first second. She leaned against the door frame and looked at him. Then she took the letter out of her pocket and set it on the workbench. He read it. He read it the second time more slowly, which meant he was working through something. Then he set it down and looked at it rather than at her. "That's a good position," he said. "Yes." "Better pay than anything you'd get here." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The forge crackled. Outside, a horse went past on the street. "When do you have to answer?" "They'd like to know by the end of the month." She paused. I haven't decided. He looked up then. There was something careful in his face, the way there was always something careful in his face. But underneath the careful, she could see something else. Something he wasn't going to say first, because he was not a man who said things first. And maybe that was a flaw, and maybe it was just who he was. It's a fair choice, he said finally. You came here to teach. The town didn't let you. Hartwell would. He pushed the letter back toward her side of the workbench. I wouldn't hold it against you. I know you wouldn't, she said. Thomas is going to be fine, he said. He's getting it. Clara too. They'll be all right. I know that too. He was looking at her steadily now. Then what's keeping you from saying yes? She picked up the letter, looked at it, put it back in her pocket. I'll tell you when I know, she said, and went back to the kitchen. The end of the month was 2 weeks away. The wind was getting colder, and the town of Iron Hollow, which had already decided what kind of woman she was, had no idea what was coming. The school board meeting was held on a Friday evening, which meant by Saturday morning every family in Iron Hollow knew the outcome before breakfast. Adeline had not been invited to attend. That told her everything she needed to know about how it would go, but she'd held a thin, unreasonable hope anyway. The kind you hold not because you believe in it, but because the alternative is giving up before the verdict, and she'd never been able to make herself do that. She'd stayed in the loft that Friday evening, sitting on the cot with a book open in her lap that she hadn't read a single page of, listening to the wind and the distant sound of the forge cooling and the particular quality of silence that a house has when the people downstairs are also waiting, Elias told her in the morning. He came up to the loft, which he'd never done before. He always waited at the bottom of the stairs, and knocked on the door frame and stood there with his hat off and his jaw set in the way she now recognized as him, preparing to say something that required effort. They voted, he said, 7-1 against reinstating you. She closed the book. Who voted for? Walt Greer. He's got the feed store on the south end. His wife's been sick a long time and he mostly keeps to himself, but he voted for you. Elias turned the hat in his hands once. For what it's worth. It's worth something, she said. She meant it. He was looking at her with that careful look. You're going to take the Hartwell position. It wasn't quite a question. She'd been in the house long enough that he could read her the way she'd learned to read him. The body's small signals, the particular quality of a silence. I should, she said. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. He was standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands in the weak morning light, and he looked. She didn't have a clean word for it. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something and not sure whether stepping forward was courage or foolishness. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I need a few days. He nodded. He put his hat back on. He started back down the stairs and then stopped halfway, without turning around. The board's decision was 7-1, he said. That means something, but a vote doesn't make a thing true. He went down. She heard the forge start a few minutes later, the bellows and then the first strike of hammer on iron, and she sat with the book in her lap and the closed door of a decision she hadn't yet opened, and she thought. She didn't get the few days she'd asked for. The story moved faster than she did, which was the nature of small towns and probably always would be. By Monday, word had spread through Iron Hollow that the board had made its decision formal and final, which seemed to embolden people in the way that official pronouncements sometimes do, as if the paperwork made the cruelty more permissible. The Holt children stopped coming on Monday morning. No note, no explanation. Margaret Holt passed Adeline on the main street that afternoon and crossed to the other side without meeting her eyes, and Adeline understood. Holt's dry goods store operated on the goodwill of its neighbors, and Percival Yates was its largest wholesale account, and the math of that situation was simple enough that she didn't need it explained. She told Elias that evening, keeping her voice level, because it was a fact and facts needed to be stated clearly. She was not going to perform feelings she was still trying to organize. I'm sorry, he said. It's Margaret's decision to make, Adeline said. She has a family to protect. That doesn't make it right. No, she agreed. It doesn't. Thomas had heard somehow, the way 12-year-olds hear everything they're not supposed to. He came to the kitchen table that night and sat down without being asked, and he looked at Adeline with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite managing it. Are you leaving? He said. She looked at him. She was not going to lie to this child. She'd decided that early, that he was old enough for honesty delivered carefully, and that the careful mattered as much as the honesty. "I'm deciding," she said. "There's a school in Hartwell," he said. It wasn't a question. Clara must have told him. Clara overheard everything, processed it at high speed, and distributed it with the unconscious efficiency of a telegraph relay station. "Yes," Adeline said. "Is it better than here?" She looked at him for a long moment. "It's safer than here," she said. "That's not always the same thing." Thomas looked at the table. He was quiet in the deliberate way he got when he was working through something that mattered to him. Then, "I read the whole chapter last night, the one about the Missouri River. I didn't need the drawings." She felt something catch in her chest. "I know," she said. "I could tell when you came down to breakfast. You had that look." "What look?" "The one you get when you've done something you didn't believe you could do." He made a face that was trying not to be moved and failing. "It's just reading," he said. "It's not just reading," she said, "and you know that." He was quiet again. Then, with the abrupt topic change of someone who's said as much as they can handle saying, "Clara wants to know if Neptune is definitely a planet or if there's still debate." "There's always debate," Adeline said. "Tell her I'll bring the relevant papers to breakfast." He nodded and left the table, and Adeline sat alone for a while with the lamplight and the particular weight of a choice that had other people's lives attached to it, which was the heaviest kind. Elias made his decision on a Tuesday. He didn't consult her first, which was both entirely in character and, she'd later admit, exactly the right call, because if he'd asked her, she would have told him not to. She found out when she came downstairs in the morning and found him nailing a piece of planed wood above the forge's wide front doors. She stood in the covered walkway between the kitchen and the shop and watched him hammer the last nail, step back, and look at what he'd done. He'd written on the board in careful, blocky letters, not beautiful letters. Elias Boone was not a man who'd spent much time on penmanship, but clear and readable. "Boone's Free School. Open to all children. Starts Monday." She stood very still. He heard her behind him and turned. He looked at her with the expression of a man who is committed to something and is now standing in it, not certain if it was right, but certain he was going to see it through. "Elias," she said. "The building's mine," he said. "The forge is big enough. We can move the anvil to one side, put tables in. I've got the lumber. I'll build them this week." "You'll lose customers." "Probably some. Yates will come after your loan again." "The loan's documented now," he said. "You made sure of that." She looked at him. "This will make things considerably worse before they get better, if they get better." "Yes," he said. "I know that." "Then why?" "Because my son read a full chapter of a book last week," he said. "And the people who decided you weren't worth their children's time didn't see that. They didn't see any of it. The Holt girl, Clara's map, Edmund figuring out his tables." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you what I'm doing, but I'd like you to still be here to teach them, if you're willing." The wind moved down the street, lifting a little dust. Somewhere across town, the official schoolhouse bell was ringing for the morning session. She looked at the sign, then at him. "You misspelled children," she said. He looked up at the sign, back at her. "I have 2 days," he said. "I'll fix it." She went back inside to start breakfast, and the decision she'd been circling for 2 weeks settled into place behind her with the quiet finality of a door finding its frame. She wasn't going to Hartwell. The town's reaction was not immediate. It moved in stages, the way weather moves in off the plains. First a change in the light, then a stillness, then the thing itself arriving with more force than you'd prepared for. The first stage was disbelief. Elias Boone, who was known as a man of few words and no theatrics, had put up a sign on his forge announcing a free school. People walked past it and read it and walked on. By afternoon, the saloon had an opinion about it, which meant by evening the whole town had several. Percival Yates came to the forge on Wednesday morning alone, which was unusual. Yates generally traveled with the implicit weight of his own influence, and arriving alone was either a miscalculation or a deliberate show of confidence. Adeline was in the kitchen with Clara when she heard Yates's voice from the shop. Not the words exactly, but the tone. The particular register of a man who considers himself important, delivering a message he expects to land. She didn't go to the doorway. She stayed where she was and listened to the shape of the conversation without its content, and after a while she heard Elias's voice, shorter and quieter, and then Yates's voice again, sharper. Then silence. Then Yates left. She heard his boots on the wooden floor of the shop, then on the street outside. Elias came into the kitchen. He sat down at the table. He looked like a man who had just said something that cost him something real. "What did he say?" she asked. "He said the town doesn't appreciate people who stir things up." He paused. "He said the school board would take legal steps if I operated an unsanctioned educational facility." "Can they?" "I don't know," he said. "I don't think the law's that clear out here yet." He looked at his hands. "He also called you a word I won't repeat in front of Clara." Clara, who was supposed to be working on her map, had gone very still. "What did you say?" Adeline asked. "I told him to get off my property." Clara made a small sound that might have been involuntary approval. Elias looked up. "He's going to make trouble." "I know," Adeline said. "Let him." He looked at her with something that wasn't quite surprise, more like confirmation of something he'd suspected about her since the first night she'd sat in this kitchen and eaten beans and salt pork without complaint and argued about Neptune with his daughter. "You're sure?" he said. "I'm sure," she said. "Build the tables. I'll figure out the schedule." But Monday came with 6 children. That was all at first, Thomas and Clara, and 2 families who lived on the east edge of town where Yates's social gravity was weakest, where the parents had heard enough about the board's maneuvering over the years to be more skeptical of its decisions. 6 children, ranging from 7 to 14, in a forge that smelled like iron and coal smoke and still bore the marks of its primary purpose on every surface. Elias had moved the anvil against the far wall and built 4 long tables from pine planks, rough but solid. He'd hung 2 lanterns from the ceiling beam for the gray days. The forge itself was banked low during school hours, just enough to take the chill off without the full noise of working heat. It was not a beautiful classroom. The benches had no backs. The light was uneven. Clara spent the first morning complaining that the table wobbled, which it did, and Thomas told her to put a folded piece of paper under the short leg, which worked, and Adeline noted privately that the problem-solving instinct she'd been cultivating in both of them was already becoming reflexive. By Wednesday of that first week, 2 more children appeared. Their mother brought them to the forge door, introduced them in a rush of nervous words, and left quickly. The way you leave when you've made a decision that might have consequences, and you'd rather not stand around waiting to find out what they are. By the following Monday, they had 11. The official school still had more. Briggs had made sure to remind anyone who'd listen that the board-sanctioned institution was open and operating and staffed by a properly credentialed teacher imported from Topeka, a young man named Patterson who had good references and no history and absolutely no ability to hold Edmund Holt's attention for more than 4 minutes, a fact Edmund reported to Adeline with the detached certainty of someone running a controlled experiment. Edmund was back. Margaret Holt had sent him and his siblings back on the Thursday of the first week, arriving herself at the forge door with a basket of apples for the second time and an expression that contained equal parts resolve and apology. "I'm sorry I pulled them," she said to Adeline at the door. "You made the decision that was right for your family at the time," Adeline said. "I made the decision that was easy," Margaret corrected, which was honest enough that Adeline respected her more for it. "I'm making a different one now, if you'll still have them." "Thursday," Adeline said. "Bring them Thursday." The wobbling table got replaced by the end of the second week. Elias built a better one on a Saturday without announcing he was going to do it, and when Adeline came down Monday morning, it was simply there. Sturdier, level. She ran her hand along the surface and looked at him across the shop, and he was already back at the forge, hammer raised, not looking at her. She understood that this was how he did things. Quietly. Without ceremony. She was learning to read love in the language of solved problems, which was a language she hadn't known existed before, but was beginning to find she recognized. The divide hit its worst point at the end of the third week. Briggs called a public meeting in the town hall, open to all residents, which was the democratic form of it, the shape of fairness without its substance. Adeline wasn't there. Elias was. He came home afterward and stood in the kitchen with his coat still on, and she knew from the way he stood that it had been bad. "What happened?" she said. "Briggs stood up in front of the whole town," he said, "and called what we're doing here a threat to the moral foundation of the community." He pulled his coat off and hung it on the peg by the door. He said that a disgraced woman teaching children out of a blacksmith shop was an embarrassment to Iron Hollow. He said parents who sent their children here were choosing scandal over stability. Adeline was quiet. "About 30 people applauded," he said. "About 20 didn't." 20 out of 50, she said. "That's not nothing." "No," he said. "It's not." He sat down. Walt Greer stood up after and said his granddaughter had learned more arithmetic in 3 weeks here than in 2 years at the schoolhouse. Briggs talked over him. Yates called it anecdotal. Of course he did. 3 families said they'd be pulling their children from here this week. He looked at her. "I don't think they all wanted to, but Yates has debts held on 2 of those farms. It's not a free choice when someone's got your mortgage." She sat down across from him. The lamp was between them the way it always was in the evenings, and outside the wind was doing its prairie thing, testing the corners of the building. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked at her. "When I came to Iron Hollow, I had $32 and a satchel full of books, and a letter that was supposed to mean I had a future here." She looked at the table. "I have sat in this kitchen every night for 6 weeks, and fixed your books, and taught your children, and cooked supper, and listened to the town tell itself stories about who I am, and I want you to know—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not sorry I stayed. Whatever happens with the school, whatever Briggs decides, whatever Yates does with his debts and his influence, I am not sorry." Elias was watching her in the way he sometimes did, fully, without the guarded surface he kept up most of the time. "I know," he said. "I need you to know that it's not just stubbornness," she said. "I mean, it is partly stubbornness, but it's also—" She stopped again. She was not a woman who struggled for words as a rule, and struggling for them now felt both humiliating and oddly appropriate. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers briefly, just a moment, not long, and then withdrew it, because he was Elias, and that was the scale of gesture he was capable of in this early stage of whatever this was. "I know that too," he said quietly. They sat there for a while. The wind pressed at the window. The lamp burned steadily between them. Outside, Iron Hollow was having its argument, drawing its lines, deciding what kind of town it wanted to be. And inside the forge, 11 children were coming back in the morning, and the tables were level, and the lanterns were hung, and Adeline Mercer had not left. The 3 families who'd pulled their children after Briggs's town hall speech did exactly what they'd said they would, and Adeline didn't fight it. She marked the empty spots at the tables on Monday morning with the same quiet she'd learned to apply to most things that hurt. Not suppressing it, just not amplifying it either. 11 became 8. 8 was still something. 8 was still worth showing up for. What she hadn't expected was Walt Greer's granddaughter. Nora Greer was 10 years old and had been attending the official school until her grandfather, apparently energized by having spoken up at the town meeting, had made a unilateral decision on a Sunday afternoon that carried the absolute authority of a man who had been waiting a long time to do something principled. He'd brought Nora to the forge door himself on Monday morning, holding her hand with the deliberate grip of someone making a statement, and introduced her to Adeline with the formal courtesy of a different era. "My granddaughter learns fast," he said. "They've been wasting her time over there for a year." He looked at Adeline steadily. He had the kind of face that life had compressed into something honest and without ornamentation. "I voted for you in that board meeting. I want you to know it wasn't a protest vote. It was a judgment call." "I know," Adeline said. "Thank you for it." He nodded, patted Nora's shoulder. "Learn something," he told her, and left. Nora Greer turned out to be exactly as fast as advertised, which created its own particular challenge. The kind of student who finishes what you give her and then looks at you with a polite, devastating patience that communicates she could have done twice as much. Adeline put her next to Clara deliberately, which resulted in 2 days of careful, competitive circling before the girls arrived at a working alliance that was going to be formidable for anyone who got in its way. 9, then, counting Nora. And the forge tables held 9 just fine. The weeks that followed had a quality she recognized from her time in Millhaven, in the period before everything went wrong, the feeling of a thing working the way it was supposed to work, when the method and the students and the material were all pulling in the same direction. It was not a perfect feeling. There were days when Thomas was impossible, retreating back into the defensive shell that years of being called slow had built around him, and she had to find the exact right angle of approach or lose him entirely for the session. There were days when Henry Holt's energy defeated everyone in the room, including her. There were days when the forge smell was so thick she taught with a headache that started behind her eyes and stayed until evening. But the work was real, and the results were real, and she knew the difference. Edmund Holt had stopped crossing his arms when he sat down. That was the first visible sign, and she'd noticed it on a Thursday in the 5th week without saying anything, because mentioning the armor when someone is slowly removing it is the fastest way to make them put it back on. He'd started arriving early, which was a thing she'd learned to watch for. The student who arrives early has decided to trust the place, at least provisionally. He came to her one afternoon after the other children had gone, while she was stacking the slates against the wall, and he was pretending to help by carrying one at a time, very slowly. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Edmund." "If I wanted to learn to keep accounts," he said, with the elaborate casualness of someone who has rehearsed this conversation, "like for a business, could you teach that?" She set down the slate she was holding and looked at him. He was 14, and he had his father's storekeeper solidity. Not the most dramatic intellect she'd taught, but reliable and precise when pointed at something concrete, with a memory for numbers that was actually quite unusual once he'd stopped being afraid of them. "I could teach that," she said. "Is this for the store?" "My father's going to hand it over to me someday," he said. "He keeps saying the accounts are complicated, and he doesn't know if I'm ready." The carefully assembled casualness slipped a little. "I want to be ready before he thinks I am, so he's surprised." She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. "Come in half an hour early on Wednesdays." He nodded, again with the elaborate nonchalance, and carried the last slate to the wall. "Thank you," he said, to the wall rather than to her, which she found she didn't mind at all. Thomas read aloud on a Wednesday morning in the 6th week, and it changed everything, not because of what it changed in the room, but because of who witnessed it. It happened like this. She'd been working with the younger children on a geography passage, and Thomas was at the far end of the table doing independent work, which was still new enough that she kept peripheral attention on it. He'd been reading a section about the Missouri River settlements, something she'd assigned because rivers made sense to him. The physical logic of water moving through landscape connected to something in how his mind worked. He started reading aloud without warning. Not for performance, not because she'd asked. She could tell by the way he did it that he wasn't even fully aware he was doing it. The words just coming out because reading silently and reading aloud had become, for the first time in his life, the same effort. His voice was low and even, working through the sentences at a careful pace, not rushing, not stumbling. He got through a full paragraph before he realized the room had gone quiet. He looked up. 7 faces looking at him. Adeline deliberately did not look up from the paper on her desk. She kept her eyes down and her expression neutral, and gave him the 3 seconds he needed to decide whether to be embarrassed or not. He decided not to be. He looked back down at his page and kept reading. She heard, from outside the forge's open door, the sound of a footstep on the wooden walkway. She knew that footstep. She kept her eyes on her paper. When the lesson ended and the children filed out, she found Elias standing just outside the door. He had his hammer still in hand and his apron on, which meant he'd come out from the working forge mid-task. He was looking at the space where Thomas had just been sitting. She waited. "He just read that whole thing," Elias said. His voice was careful and flat in the way it got when he was working to keep it from being something else. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He set the hammerhead down on the walkway railing and kept his hand around the handle. "His mother used to try to teach him," he said. "Every night, for 2 years. He'd get frustrated and she'd get frustrated and they'd both end up feeling bad. She thought it was her fault." He paused. "After she died, I tried. Same thing." Adeline didn't say anything. Some moments needed room. "It's not her fault," he said. "It's not his. It's not mine." He looked at her. "You did something different." I did something that happened to work for the way his mind works, she said carefully. Someone else might have found it before me, with enough time. But they didn't, he said. You did. She looked at him standing there with his hammer and his apron and the complicated grief of a man watching his son do something he'd been afraid the boy would never do, and she didn't have a clean response to that, so she didn't try to find one. He's going to read to Clara tonight, she said. He doesn't know I overheard him planning it. Let him think it's his idea. Something moved through Elias's face. A quick, involuntary thing, quickly managed. He picked up his hammer. I'll act surprised, he said. You won't have to act, she said. He went back into the forge. She stood on the walkway for a moment in the pale afternoon sun, and the feeling that moved through her was not triumph exactly. It was something older and quieter than triumph. The particular satisfaction of work that was actually worth doing. Well, the official school's numbers had been declining for 3 weeks before Briggs acknowledged it publicly, which he did in the way of men who have been losing ground, by attacking the ground they'd lost rather than examining why they'd lost it. He came to the forge on a Thursday morning. He didn't knock, which told her something. He walked through the open doors the way men like Briggs walk into spaces they've decided they own by virtue of their position. And he stopped when he saw the tables and the children and Adeline standing at the front of the room with a piece of chalk and a makeshift board Elias had built from a planed pine plank painted black. He stood there for a moment, taking in the room. 8 children looked back at him with varying degrees of interest and wariness. Nora Greer watched him with the frank assessment of someone who has decided adults are largely worth studying, but rarely worth impressing. Miss Mercer, Briggs said. A word. Good morning, Chairman Briggs, she said. We're in the middle of a lesson. I can speak with you in an hour. His jaw tightened. This can't wait. Then you're welcome to wait outside and I'll come to you when we're finished. She turned back to the board. Edmund, you had the answer for the 3rd column. Edmund, to his considerable credit, gave the answer without hesitation, which was better than he would have managed 2 months ago, and Adeline made a small note of it internally because Edmund's progress was the kind that deserved to be marked even when it was inconvenient for other people. Briggs waited outside. She gave him the full hour. When she stepped out into the cool air, he was standing with his arms behind his back, which was his version of composure. He looked at her with the expression she'd seen in that first council room, not cruel exactly, but sealed against information that might complicate his position. The board is prepared to offer you the schoolhouse position, he said. She looked at him. I'm sorry? The teaching position, the one that was offered last year and subsequently rescinded. He said it in the careful tone of a man reading from a prepared text inside his own head. The board has reconsidered in light of the current situation. The current situation. 14 children sitting in a blacksmith shop because their parents had lost confidence in the institution he ran. What changed? She asked. Circumstances, he said. Chairman Briggs, she said. I'd like a more specific answer than that. His jaw worked slightly. Several families have expressed concerns about the quality of instruction at the schoolhouse. The board feels that consolidation of educational resources would serve the community better at this time. You want me to close the Forge School and come back under the board's authority, she said, so that the parents who left come back too. He looked at her with the slight stiffening of a man who does not like having things stated plainly when they could be left ambiguous. The position comes with formal salary and the full backing of the board. I see. She folded her hands in front of her. And the letter from Cartwright County? The account of my conduct in Millhaven? A pause. The board is prepared to set that matter aside. Set it aside, she repeated, not retract it, not correct the record, just set it aside. Miss Mercer. The reason I was denied this position, she said, was a false account written by a man with a personal grievance against me, and you accepted that account without investigation because it was convenient to do so. What you're offering me now is the same position without an acknowledgement that the original decision was wrong. She looked at him steadily. I'd like to know if the board is willing to formally state, for the record, that the account from Cartwright County was unsubstantiated and that my dismissal from the position was unjust. Briggs looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved between them. That's a significant ask, he said. Yes, she said. It is. He left without committing to anything, which was itself a kind of answer, at least for now. She went back inside and picked up the chalk and finished the lesson, and told herself that the tightness in her chest was manageable, which it was, barely, and that manageable was sufficient. She told Elias that evening. He listened without interrupting, which was how he listened to everything, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You turned it down," he said. "I didn't turn it down," she said. "I put conditions on it." "Conditions you don't think they'll meet. Conditions they should have met before offering it." She looked at him. "I'm not going back to teaching under a board that won't admit it was wrong. I'd be walking into the same situation with different furniture." He nodded slowly. "And if they don't meet them? Then we keep going," she said. "Here." He looked at her. "We," he said. It was a single word, and it sat on the table between them with a weight that was disproportionate to its size. "Yes," she said, meeting his eyes. "We." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "I should tell you something." He turned his coffee cup in both hands, looking at it. "I've been thinking about building a proper room, off the back of the kitchen, with a real window, not the loft window." He paused. "Not for the school, for—" He stopped. "For?" she said. "For you," he said, not looking up. "If you were staying, longer term." She looked at him. The lamp was between them. The house was quiet around them, the children asleep, the forge cold for the night. She was aware of the exact distance across the table and the exact quality of the silence, and the fact that Elias Boone, who never said more than what was necessary, had just said something considerably more than necessary. "I'm staying," she said. He looked up. "I know that's not, I'm not trying to—" He stopped, started again. "I don't want you to feel obligated because of the children or the school or any of it. I want you to stay because you want to stay." "Elias," she said. "What?" "I've wanted to stay since the second week," she said. "I just needed to be sure it was my choice and not my circumstance." He was very still for a moment. Then he set down the coffee cup and looked at her with the full, unguarded look that he usually kept carefully managed, and it was considerable. She felt it the way you feel a change in altitude, something shifting in the air pressure. "All right," he said quietly. "All right," she said. Eat it. The formal retraction came 11 days later, which was longer than she'd hoped and shorter than she'd feared. It arrived not as a public announcement, but as a written document, delivered to the forge by Walt Greer, who had apparently been the one to push for it, relentlessly, in a series of board meetings she wasn't invited to, and signed by 5 of the 7 board members, Briggs included. It stated, in the careful, reluctant language of institutions acknowledging error, that the account from Cartwright County had been accepted without adequate investigation, that the original dismissal of Miss Adeline Mercer's application had been improperly handled, and that the board regretted the inconvenience caused. Regretted the inconvenience. She read that phrase twice and then set it aside, because it was the phrasing of men who were sorry they'd been wrong, but not sorry they'd been wrong to her, and she understood that she was not going to get more than this, and that getting this was itself something that didn't happen often enough in the world. Walt Greer was still standing in the doorway when she finished reading. He had his hat in his hands, as men in doorways in Iron Hollow apparently always did. "It's not enough," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it's something." "You going to take the position?" She folded the letter carefully and set it on the workbench. "I'm going to negotiate the terms," she said. "The curriculum, the methods, the approach to students who learn differently. I want those things in writing before I agree to anything." Walt Greer made a sound that was clearly approval. "Briggs isn't going to like that." "He doesn't have to like it," she said. "He has to agree to it." Greer put his hat back on. "My granddaughter told me you're teaching her navigation by stars," he said. "I am." She told her father. A pause. He cried a little. "Don't tell her I told you that." Adeline looked at him. "I won't," she said. He left. She stood in the forge, empty now, the children gone for the afternoon, and looked at the tables Elias had built, the plank board painted black with chalk dust still on it, the shelves she'd put up along one wall for the primers and workbooks. She looked at Thomas's illustrations still pinned to the beam, the ones she'd drawn in the early weeks to help him, that he'd kept and added to himself, a whole vocabulary and pictures that was entirely his own system now, and that he no longer needed but kept anyway, the way you keep the training wheels even after you don't need them anymore, as a record of having needed them. The room smelled like iron and chalk, and the particular combination of 9 children spending their mornings somewhere they'd learned to trust. She thought about Vernon Cole and his letter, and what it had set in motion. And she thought about the stagecoach and the $32 and the feed crate in the dark. And she thought about Elias's stairway and the shelf beside the loft window and the hand across the table that had lasted only a moment and said everything. Some things, she thought, broke you open precisely so something better could grow into the space. She didn't say that to anyone. It was the kind of thought that only survived in private. But she held it for a moment in the quiet forge, and then she went to find Elias to tell him about the retraction, and the afternoon light came through the doorway at the particular angle it came through at this time of year, and Iron Hollow outside was just a town, imperfect and suspicious and slowly, reluctantly, beginning to reconsider itself. The negotiations with the board took 2 weeks, which was 1 week longer than Adeline had patience for and 1 week shorter than Briggs had hoped. He was a man who used delay the way other men used argument, as a tool for wearing down the opposition. She didn't wear down. She came to each meeting with the same list, written in her clearest hand, and she didn't remove items from it to make the conversation easier. The list had 7 points. She wanted written curriculum authority, meaning the board could not override her teaching methods by vote without documented educational justification. She wanted the right to admit any child whose parents requested enrollment, without the board having approval power over individual students. She wanted the Forge School formally recognized as a satellite classroom under the same district umbrella, so that the children who'd been learning there didn't lose credit for the months they'd already worked. She wanted a formal letter of record correcting the Cartwright County account, to be sent to every district within the county. She wanted a salary that reflected her 6 years of experience, not the entry-level figure Briggs had initially proposed. She wanted the plank board in the forge replaced with a proper slate board in the schoolhouse, and she wanted Thomas Boone's reading progress formally documented in the district record as evidence that her methods produced results where previous approaches had failed. That last one surprised Briggs. She could see it on his face. He'd expected her to fight hardest for the salary or the curriculum authority, and she'd barely flinched on either of those. The Thomas point made him look at her differently. "Why does that matter to you?" he said at the third meeting. "Just the two of them, Greer present as witness. The boy's not even a district student officially. Because in 2 years, she said, someone is going to want to credit someone else with his progress. I want the record clear while the record can still be checked." Briggs looked at her for a long moment. Then he wrote it down. She got 6 of the 7 points. The satellite classroom recognition was the one that fell. The legal framework for it didn't exist clearly enough in Kansas territory law, and even Walt Greer advised her to let that one go for now. She let it go. 6 out of 7 was not a defeat. 6 out of 7 was the kind of victory that looked modest from the outside and meant everything from the inside. She signed the agreement on a Tuesday morning in the same town hall room where Briggs had read Vernon Cole's letter aloud 4 months earlier. She used the same pen. She noticed that and didn't say anything about it, and filed it in the category of small private satisfactions that don't require an audience. She told Elias that evening, and his response was to say very little and then go out to the back of the property for about 20 minutes, which was where she'd learned he went when he needed to process something without an audience. She let him go. When he came back, he sat down at the table and looked at his hands and said, "You could have taken the Hartwell position 3 months ago." "Yes," she said, "paid better, easier situation. Nobody there knew your name in a bad way." "Yes," she said again. He looked up. "Why didn't you?" She'd thought about how to answer this question, in the abstract, several times. Now that it was being asked directly, she found the rehearsed answers felt too clean, too composed. "Because leaving felt like agreeing with them," she said, "about who I was." She paused. "And because by the time Hartwell was a real option, I already knew I didn't want to go." "Because of the children," he said, testing the explanation, not dismissing it. "Because of the children," she agreed, "and because of you." He held very still for a moment, in the way he had, that quality of stillness that wasn't absence but its opposite, a kind of concentrated presence. "I'm not easy to live with," he said. "I know that." "Nobody is," she said. "You're not particularly difficult either. You're just private. Careful." She looked at him. "I'm not frightened of careful." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I built the room." She blinked. "What?" "The room off the back of the kitchen. I finished it last week." He was looking at the table. "I was waiting to tell you until after the board thing was settled. I didn't want it to feel like... I didn't want you to think I was assuming." She sat with that for a moment. Elias Boone, who said less than most people and meant more by it, had built her a room while she was negotiating her right to stay in his town and had not mentioned it because he didn't want her to feel pressured. That was... She didn't have a single clean word for what that was. "Can I see it?" she said. He stood. She followed him through the kitchen and out the back door, and he'd built a short covered walkway. 3 steps. Connecting the kitchen to a new addition she hadn't noticed being assembled because she'd been deliberately not noticing things that might make the board negotiation emotionally complicated. It was a small room, maybe 14 feet square, which was larger than the loft. It had 2 windows, both facing east so it would get morning light. The floor was pine plank, sanded smooth. There was a proper door with a real latch. He'd put a shelf along one wall, long and level, already anchored at both ends. She stood in the middle of it and turned around slowly. "The shelf is for books," he said from the doorway. "I know what the shelf is for," she said. "There's room for a proper desk," he said. "If you wanted one, I can build it." She turned and looked at him in the doorway. The evening light was behind him, and he was standing there with his hands at his sides in the way he stood when he wasn't sure what to do with them, which was a quality she had come to find, without expecting to, without looking for it, something close to dear. "Elias," she said. "Yeah." "Ask me properly." He looked at her. Something moved through his face. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition, like a man who has been preparing for something and is startled to find the moment has actually arrived. "Adeline," he said. He didn't move from the doorway. He said it in his flat, honest voice, without decoration. "I would like you to stay. Not as a boarder, not as a teacher for my children. I would like you to stay as mine. And I know that's not a modern thing to say, and I know you're capable of anything without my name attached to it. But I'm asking anyway because I'm better with you here than I've been in 3 years, and I think you know that." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's a good answer," she said. "It's the true one," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'll stay." He exhaled, just slightly, just enough that she could see it, and she understood that he'd been holding that breath for longer than just this conversation. He crossed the room in 3 steps and kissed her, once, the way a man kisses someone when he's been careful for a long time and is choosing, deliberately, to stop being careful. It was not a graceful moment. She'd knocked her elbow on the doorframe and he'd misjudged the angle slightly and they'd both had to adjust, and it was human and real and considerably better for being both those things. From the kitchen, clearly audible through the newly built wall, came the sound of Clara saying to Thomas, in a whisper that could have been heard from the forge, "I told you." And Thomas, with the weary dignity of an older sibling, "You didn't tell me anything. You speculated." "Speculation that was correct is called being right," Clara said. Adeline pressed her forehead against Elias's shoulder and laughed, quietly, and he made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she'd heard from him yet. And they stood like that for a moment in the room he'd built her, with the children arguing in the kitchen and the evening coming down over Iron Hollow, outside the east-facing windows. They were married in March, which was not the most beautiful month in Kansas. The ground was still half frozen, and the wind came in hard from the north, and the ceremony was held inside the Greer family's front room because the church had been ambiguous about hosting it, and Adeline had declined to negotiate with ambivalence a second time. Walt Greer's wife, Sarah, officiated, which was legal enough in Kansas territory if you were flexible in your interpretation of the relevant statutes, and Greer himself was flexible. There were 14 people present. Margaret Holt brought a cake. Edmund carried it from the store and managed not to drop it, which he accepted congratulations for as though it had required considerable skill. Thomas stood beside his father in a shirt he'd ironed himself, which Adeline knew because she'd watched him iron it twice that morning and not said anything. Clara wore the dress she'd been wearing when Adeline first arrived, the pale blue one, and had added a ribbon she'd acquired from somewhere and wasn't explaining. She stood at Adeline's side with the composed gravity of someone who has decided this is an important occasion and intends to honor it, which was the most Clara way of doing anything. Adeline had no family present. That was a plain fact, and she held it plainly. Her parents were gone, her sister was in Pennsylvania and couldn't make the distance in time. The people who should have been in the room were not in the room. She'd written her sister a letter and received one back that said, "I'm so glad you found something worth staying for," which was enough. Sometimes enough was all you got, and all you got was sufficient. Elias said his vows in his flat, exact voice, looking at her directly, and the directness of it was its own kind of eloquence. She said hers back, and meant them with the specific, unromantic precision of a woman who had thought carefully about what she was agreeing to and agreed to it anyway, which is the only way promises are worth making. Clara cried a little, which she denied afterward with great conviction. Thomas did not cry, but he put his hand on his father's arm for a moment after the ceremony, briefly, and Elias covered it with his own hand for exactly as long as Thomas needed. And Adeline saw this happen from across the room and tucked it away in the part of herself where she kept the things that mattered most. She returned to the schoolhouse in April when the ground was softening and the light was coming back. The negotiated terms held. Briggs was not warm about it, but he was professional, which was the most she'd wanted from him. The curriculum she implemented was not what Iron Hollow's children had been taught before. She brought in geography and natural science alongside reading and arithmetic. She used the illustrated word method she'd developed for Thomas with any student who showed the same patterns. She let children move at different speeds through different subjects because speed in one area had nothing to do with capacity in another. And she told her students this directly and repeatedly until she saw them start to believe it. Some parents approved, some didn't. She found she'd stopped organizing her decisions around which was which. The Forge School didn't disappear entirely. It became what it had always been most naturally, an overflow, a place for the children who needed something the formal room couldn't provide, the ones who came in on Saturday mornings because they had questions the weekday schedule didn't have room for. Thomas taught there sometimes. Not formally. He was 13. He would have rejected the word teaching with some indignation, but he'd sit with the younger children and work through the picture word system with them, drawing illustrations in the margins of their papers with a patience and accuracy that came from having been on the receiving end of it himself. Adeline watched this happen without commenting on it, because some things grow better without direct sunlight. Edmund Holt had the store's accounts fully in order by summer. His father showed them to Adeline in June with an expression of a man who has been handed something he didn't expect and doesn't quite know where to put it. "He did this himself," James Holt said. "I didn't help him." "I know," she said. "He's 14. "He is," she agreed. Holt looked at the ledger in his hands. "I owe you something," he said, "for pulling my children when you first started at the Forge, and for what Edmund's become. Both of those things." "You don't owe me anything," she said, "but I'll take an account at the store." He laughed, which was apparently not something James Holt did frequently enough, because he looked briefly surprised at himself. "Done," he said. Nora Greer entered the county academic competition in September and placed second in geography, which would have been first if the judge hadn't made an error calculating one of her scores, a fact Nora identified immediately, documented precisely, and presented to the competition officials in a written note that was so politely devastating it was reprinted in the county paper. Walt Greer read it aloud at his supper table 3 nights in a row. He reported this to Adeline without embarrassment. Clara, at 9, had moved past the available curriculum entirely and was working through Adeline's own books, the ones from college, the ones she'd carried in the bottom of her trunk across 500 miles of prairie on the grounds that she might need them someday. She was learning about celestial navigation from a maritime text that was technically written for adult sailors, and the fact that this was not a standard educational approach for a 9-year-old was a concern Adeline had decided to stop having. "She's going to run out of things to learn," Elias said one evening, with the particular worried father tone that was different from his other tones. "She's going to have to find larger places," Adeline said. "But that's not yet. That's years from now. Right now she has plenty." "And Thomas?" Adeline considered. Thomas had started helping in the forge in the afternoons. Real help, not just errands, his father teaching him the actual work of iron and heat and precision. And he read in the evenings by the lamp with the total absorption of someone making up for lost time, which she supposed he was. He'd told her last week, with minimal preamble, that he thought he might want to study engineering someday. He'd said it the way he said things that mattered to him, quickly and quietly, and then looked at the floor. She'd said, "Then we'd better make sure your arithmetic is solid." He'd said, "It's already solid." She'd said, "Then we'd better make sure I agree with your assessment of solid." He'd almost smiled. "Yeah, all right," he'd said. "Thomas," Adeline said now to Elias, "is going to be fine in the specific and particular way of people who learn things the hard way, and therefore learn them completely." Elias was quiet for a moment. "That's because of you." "It's because of him," she said. "I just stayed in the room long enough." He looked at her. "You know what I mean." "I know what you mean," she said, "and I know you mean it genuinely. But I want Thomas to know, when he's older and looks back on this, that what he built belongs to him, not to me, not to you. The reading, the confidence, the plan about engineering. Those are his. I was just present." Elias turned that over for a moment. "You're more than present," he said. "Right now I'm your wife and their teacher and not much else distinguishable," she said. "That's plenty. That's actually genuinely plenty." In October, 1 full year after the stagecoach had dropped her at the edge of town like an apology, the school board voted to add a second classroom to the Iron Hollow schoolhouse. Briggs announced it at a public meeting that Adeline attended this time, seated in the third row beside Margaret Holt, who had become something between an ally and a friend in the particular Frontier way, which meant they didn't talk about their feelings, but they brought each other things. A jar of preserved apples, a length of good fabric, the kind of practical help that in another context might have been called affection. Briggs said the expansion was due to growing enrollment and community investment in education. He did not mention Adeline by name. He did not mention the Forge School, or the months of division, or the families who'd voted with their feet before the board had been willing to listen. He packaged it as a forward-looking decision by a forward-looking institution. She had expected to be angrier about that than she was. Sitting in the third row, she found she mostly just felt tired in the way you feel tired after something has finally ended. Not the exhaustion of defeat, but the release of having carried something heavy for a long time and being able to set it down. The town was going to tell this story its own way. Towns always did. The official version would sand down the edges and reassign the credit and make it into something more comfortable than what it had actually been. But the children knew. Edmund knew, and Nora, and the two families from the east edge of town, and Thomas, who had stood up in a Forge classroom and read aloud without being asked. The children would carry what actually happened in the version of it that lived in their bodies, in the way Edmund checked his own accounts without asking permission, in the way Clara asked questions that made adults uncomfortable in the best possible way, in the way Thomas taught the younger ones with a patience that came directly from having needed it himself. You couldn't edit that out of the record. It was already in them. After the meeting, she walked home through the main street of Iron Hollow in the October evening. The forge was lit ahead of her. Elias working late, the light of it visible from the road. The schoolhouse bell was quiet at this hour, but she could picture it. The iron bell she'd walked past on that first day when the door was bolted against her. The bell that would ring tomorrow morning for a classroom that now had her name on it in the official record. She was not the woman who'd arrived here. She knew that. The woman who'd arrived had $32 and a bone-deep need to prove something to a town that wasn't listening. She'd proven it, eventually, and the proving had mattered less than she'd expected, and the staying had mattered more. What she'd found here, the children, the man at the forge, the room with east-facing windows, the shelf that was unambiguously hers, none of it had been what she came looking for. She'd come looking for a job. She'd found something that didn't have a single clean name, which was probably the nature of anything worth having. She pushed open the forge door. Elias looked up from the anvil. He was covered in soot, and his hair was damp from the heat, and he looked at her with the direct, unguarded look that he still sometimes deployed without warning. The one that had taken her several months to understand was just how he looked at her specifically, his face doing something it apparently didn't do for anyone else. "How was the meeting?" he said. "Predictable," she said. "They're adding a second classroom. He set the hammer down. Good. They didn't mention us. Also predictable, he said. Yes. She leaned against the doorframe. Thomas left his reading lamp on again. I'll tell him. He knows, she said. He just does it anyway. Elias almost smiled. Wonder where he gets that from, he said, meaning the stubborn doing things anyway quality, which they'd both noticed in Thomas, and both recognized without discussing it openly. I couldn't possibly say, she said. She crossed the forge and kissed him once, quick and unremarkable in the way of people who have been doing this long enough that it's become its own language, a thing said in passing, meaning something that doesn't need elaborating. He smelled like smoke and iron, and the particular version of his soap that she'd bought at the Holt store 3 weeks ago, and which had already become, without ceremony, simply the smell of home. She went through to the kitchen. Clara was at the table with the maritime navigation text, making notes in the margin in her small, precise handwriting. She looked up when Adeline came in with the bright-eyed alertness of a child waiting to share something. I figured out the sextant calculation, she said, the one that was wrong in the book. Adeline sat down across from her. Show me, she said. Clara showed her. She was right. The book had a rounding error in the worked example that would have put a sailor 15 miles off course, which was the kind of thing that mattered if you were in the middle of the ocean, and considerably less if you were 9 years old in Kansas, but which Clara had caught with the focused attention of someone who treated accuracy as a matter of personal honor. You should write to the publisher, Adeline said. Clara's eyes went wide. Can I do that? You just demonstrated an error in their text with clear supporting calculation, Adeline said. Yes, you can do that. Clara looked at the book, then at Adeline. What if they don't listen? Then you've still done the right thing, Adeline said, and the error is still documented, and someone else will find your documentation someday and know you were right. Clara considered this with the seriousness it deserved. All right, she said, I'll write the letter tomorrow. Good, Adeline said. She pulled the lamp slightly closer and looked at the margin notes, the small, careful hand, the chain of reasoning laid out without gaps. There was a mind here that was going to go considerably further than Iron Hollow, Kansas, and they both knew it, and Adeline's job at this particular moment was simply to not get in its way. Thomas came downstairs for water, saw them bent over the book, and stopped in the kitchen doorway. What's wrong with the book? He said, because he'd learned to read the quality of their attention. Error in the sextant calculation, Clara said, without looking up. Huh, Thomas said. He looked at Adeline. Did you catch it, or did she? She did, Adeline said. He looked at his sister with the expression of an older sibling recalibrating an assessment, which happened periodically and always required a moment of processing. Huh, he said again, with slightly more weight. Good catch, he told Clara, and went back upstairs. Clara watched him go. Then she looked at Adeline with a small, private satisfaction that she was trying to make look casual. He said good catch, she said. I heard, Adeline said. He never says things like that. He's learning, Adeline said. Clara nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd been observing, and went back to her notes. And Adeline sat across the kitchen table from this fierce, curious child who had spent the last year teaching her as much as she'd taught in return, teaching her what it looked like when a person was given room to grow without being told in advance what shape they'd take. And she thought about the woman on the feed crate in the dark, $32 and nowhere to go, and she thought, you couldn't have known. You couldn't have known what was inside this. Outside, the Kansas wind was doing what it always did, moving through without asking permission, carrying things from somewhere else to somewhere else, indifferent to what it crossed. Inside the forge house on the edge of Iron Hollow, a lamp burned in the kitchen and a lamp burned upstairs, and the forge light came through the wall in the thin lines it always did at this hour, and it was ordinary and impermanent and entirely, completely enough. Some places break you down to find out what you're made of. Some people too. And some decisions, the ones you make in the dark with nothing left to lose, the ones that look like stubbornness from the outside and feel like survival from the inside, turn out to be the truest ones you ever make. Adeline Mercer had come to Iron Hollow to teach. In the end, she'd taught and been taught and built something that no school board vote could fully account for and no letter of record could completely contain. She'd put down roots in soil that didn't want her, and the roots had held, and the thing that had grown from them was not what she'd planted. It was better.